Hi there, welcome to Walks on the Wild Side and the first episode of Walks with You, where I'll be taking a look at your photos just like the ones behind me. So let's get going with the first one, and I'm really pleased to show you a photo from a young man who is one to watch. This photo of a stone chat was taken by William Lambourne, who's aged just 13. Now, he's been interested in wildlife all his life, but he only took up wildlife photography during the lockdown. So my first reaction to this photo is just how beautiful it is. He's got some lovely separation between the subject and the background, and some beautiful foreground blur of the gorse bush that the bird is sat on. And this photo was taken on an overcast day, which is absolutely perfect for bird portraits. So William said he saw a group of stone chats and waited for one of them to come to that perfect perch. And well done, William, that's absolutely the right thing to do. And it's just along the lines of what I was talking about in a video a couple of weeks ago on having a vision for your photograph. So rather than charging in and go to the stone chats to try and get the type of photo that you'll just randomly encounter, you've pictured the photograph with the bird in the place that you wanted it and waited for that bird to come along to get that photo. So that's a great example of the kind of thing to do. In this video, I'm going to talk about the things that are good that you should carry on doing, but I'm also going to talk about the things that you should change and the things that you could change. And remembering that photography is an art form, and so it's down to artistic intent and subjectivity. So I really want to make clear the things that are essential to change and the things that you might like to choose to do in the future. So what William's done here that is good is the right behaviours to get the kind of photograph that he wants to get. But there are some things, William, that you should think about changing, and I'm going to move on to those now. So after my first reaction of what a beautiful photo this is, my second reaction was, wow, this is really quite noisy. And if I zoom in, I'm going to zoom in here at say 200% to really help you see that noise. But around the bird, there's a lot of noise. And so I was thinking of talking about reducing that noise. But then I started to look around the rest of the picture, and you can see in the background that it's really clean. And if I come down here to the foreground, the gorse bush, you can see that that's really clean. And I'm pretty sure that you've done some noise reduction here, William. But what you've done afterwards are some further adjustments around the bird that have introduced some more noise. And it's got quite a harsh line that you can see here between the noise and the clean background. So to help you see what's happened here, I'm just going to apply a little sharpening mask. And if I turn that mask on, you can see that William's applied a radial mask. And you can see the oval of where that is as those white dots in the background. And I think what you've done is raise the exposure of the bird and the surroundings of the bird. But in doing so, you've actually blown out a little bit of the plumage around its neck. Now, I'm the first to say, photos don't have to be technically perfect, but we shouldn't make them less technically perfect by our editing style. So that's something to think about. And what you want to do actually is make sure that you've done all of those exposure adjustments before you apply noise reduction, because by raising the shadows, you actually introduce more noise into the picture. So you've done some work to take away the noise and then introduced more, but in a very localized way. So that's what you should do. Now let's move on to things that you could do. And one of those is thinking about the perch. Now, because you've raised the exposure with that radial dial, you've actually made the perch that the bird sat upon feel a little softer. When you zoom in, you can see it's sharp, but because there are some bright highlights around the edges of it, it feels soft. Now, perhaps the viewers out there will have experienced this themselves. There'll be occasions where you photograph something, and when you look at the whole photograph, it feels soft. But when you zoom into the details, it's actually really crisp. And what I find often causes that is luminance. So every colour in the photograph is affected by three things: the hue, or the shade of the colour, the saturation, or the intensity of the colour, and the luminance or the brightness of the colour. So let's go over to the HSL panel in Lightroom and I'll show you what I mean. So if I find the greens and the luminance of the greens, and I just drop the luminance down a little bit, just look how that makes it a bit crisper. I'm going to turn it off and on again and just keep flashing them on and off so that you can see the difference. And what that luminance has done is bring down the highlights around the edge of the perch, which makes it look that little bit crisper. So if you're ever in a situation where something feels a little soft, but actually it's crisp and sharp, you could think about reducing the luminance of the colours that are affected. So William, well done. Big round of applause, please, from everybody out there. This is a fantastic photo, and for a 13-year-old young guy, you've done such a great job here. But one thing that you could learn is that sequence of editing. So perhaps applying the noise reduction right at the end after you've done everything to do with the exposure. But what a great job, and thank you, William, for submitting the photo. When I put out the requests for photos, I was a little worried at first. What if nobody sends anything in? But I've been inundated with photos. I'm really pleased with the volume that I got in. And sorry to everyone I've not been able to choose to take part in this video. But as a thank you, this time I am getting back to everybody who sent me a photo. So if you've not heard from me already, you should hear from me in the next week or so with my thoughts on your photo. So next up, we've got a photo of a green woodpecker from Thomas, the Hampshire birder. And I was really pleased to get a green woodpecker photo. I can't resist them. It's my absolute favourite bird. But that's not the sole reason that I chose this photo. It is a really nice photo. And Thomas would like to start to print and maybe sell his photos at some point in the future. And so Thomas, some of the thoughts and feedback that I'll give you now are focused around that particular aim. And Thomas has some other lovely photos on his Flickr profile, so please go and check that out. In particular, there's another green woodpecker shot that I absolutely love, where the green woodpecker's got its head poking out of its nest, and you've shot it with something that's created some diagonal foreground blur, and it's absolutely beautiful, Thomas. This photo that you've sent me is good, but that photo is great. So firstly, what have you done well? Well, you've definitely done well to get close enough to this bird to get a really nice photo of it, because I can tell you from first-hand experience that green woodpeckers are difficult to get close to. They're quite skittish, they don't like to be watched, and they'll fly off with a moment's notice. In terms of the technique, you've done really well to get its eye absolutely sharp, and around its beak you can just see some wood shavings where it's been pecking away at that wood, which is absolutely beautiful. And that sharpness is fantastic, and you should always be aiming to focus on the bird's eye or the head at the very least. So that's a great job. And something that you definitely should do is think about getting the whole bird in focus. Now, when we look at this close up, you can see that although the head's in focus, it gets quite soft the lower down the bird that you get. And as you get to the tail, it's fairly out of focus. Now, you've shot this to f9, which is great, and I'm really glad to see that you're not just simply going for shooting wide open. Now, in this case, you've got such a distance to the background that it really doesn't matter if you go for an even narrower aperture. I regularly shoot things at f13 or f14, and in this case you could absolutely do that. And by doing that, you would have the bottom part of the bird in focus. Now, when I look at this photo and try and project in my mind where you would have been stood in relation to the bird, I think you were ever so slightly looking up at it, but the tree was perhaps ever so slightly leaning away from you, or maybe towards you, but perhaps more likely away. So you were photographing up towards the bird, the tree was leaning slightly away from you, and that meant that as you got the bird's eye in the plane of focus, the rest of the bird was slightly outside that plane of focus. So a narrower aperture would have really helped, and it would make three differences to this photo. One, you'd have had to have put your ISO up a little bit. Number two, you'd have got the whole bird in focus. And number three, it would have made those background bokeh balls slightly smaller. But essentially, you'd have got a very similar photo to the one that you've taken here. The reason I say that it's really important to get your whole bird in focus is specifically because you want to print Thomas. Now, I can tell you from experience that if you print a photo like this large, it'll be really apparent that not all of the bird is in focus. It may not be obvious to people who look at this photo on a small screen, like a phone or a tablet, or maybe even a laptop. But when you blow this photo up to A3 or maybe bigger, it'll be really apparent. And there's one other thing that you need to watch out for, and that is that you've crushed some of the shadows around the bird's face. So if we zoom in here, you can see that there's a little patch of pure black just under the bird's eye and another one just above the bird's eye, but the rest of the blackness around the eye has some texture in it. Now again, I'm the first to say that photos don't have to be technically perfect to be nice, but what I will tell you from experience is that any crushed shadows or blown out highlights stand out even more when you print them on paper. And also you've got to account for the fact that when you're selling a print, you're selling it because someone wants to hang it in their home or their office or something like that. So they're going to spend a long time looking at it, far longer than someone who's just swiping through your Instagram or Flickr profile. And because they'll spend longer looking at it, they'll notice these little imperfections even more. So that's just something to watch out for. Now, moving on to things that you could do, I really love that background bokeh, but you can see that it's slightly off to one side and it's not uniform across the background. Now, I was actually in a very similar situation to this myself recently. When I filmed the video about birds at a feeding station, I did take some shots of birds on branches at the trees around. Now, I didn't include these because it wasn't what the video was about, but I got a photo of a dunnock with some beautiful bokeh in the background. That bokeh was just off to the right of the bird, and it made a kind of three bands. You got the tree, a dark band, and then a bokeh band. And so for the next shot I took on exactly the same branch, I moved ever so slightly, probably no more than about 3 or 4 centimetres. I literally just shuffled across a little bit on the mat that I was on. And I found that I could get the whole background with beautiful bokeh. And so I got this other photo of a robin where there was a more uniform background. And what that does is it gives you less distractions. So people aren't looking at the background and noticing the contrast between the areas of bokeh and no bokeh. They just see a background that complements the bird. And you could do the same thing here. If in the moment you had taken a couple of steps to your right, you'd have got more of that blue bokeh in the background. So that's not something that's essential, but it is a choice that you could make in order to have less distractions in the background and a background that complements the bird more. But Thomas, what a great photo. I'm always overjoyed to see a green woodpecker, and thank you very much for submitting it. And next up, we've got a black and white macro shot of a hydrangea from Agnès Pigou. Apologies if I've got your name wrong. I'm assuming it's the French pronunciation, but if it's pronounced any other way, I'm sorry. But I'm really pleased that you submitted this photo, and Agnès says that she took this photo after watching my video about black and white macro photography. So thanks very much for going out and giving this a try. It is really nice, but there's a few key things that you could do to make some changes. Agnès has some other lovely photos on her Flickr profile, including more black and white macro and some lovely shots of blue tits flying to and from a feeder. So go and check out Agnès' Flickr profile and show her some love for those photos. Now the first thing is, it's not obvious what to do in terms of where to focus with a flower. If you're photographing a bird or an insect or an animal or something, you always want to focus on their eye, but where do you focus on a flower? And last year I started making a video about this exact topic, but those of you who watch the channel regularly will know I broke a lens partway through filming that and couldn't carry on. Well, that lens has been mended now, and hopefully this summer I'll be back out there with some wildflowers and will give you some tips about flower photography. But usually when you're face onto the flower, you're looking straight on to the flower with all the petals coming out flat to you. What you want to do is focus on the very centre of the flower. And you can see here on this photo that the focus point is somewhere around here, just underneath the flower. And so I would recommend that next time you try this, you want to focus on the very centre of the flower and let the rest of the photo drift into out of focus blur. So that's what you should do. Now let's move on to things that you could do. And this is really all about the composition. So you've got a beautiful diagonal line running through this photo, but it doesn't quite go corner to corner. And you'll find that the composition looks much stronger when you've got that diagonal line running from the corners. So there's a couple of things you could do here in post-production. You could rotate the photo slightly to make that diagonal line, or you could crop to a 1:1 square crop, which will put those approximately in the corner, and that just feels a little bit nicer. And you'll tend to find that people do like diagonals in photos because that's what we are accustomed to looking for when we read. For example, when we scan a page and we're looking for keywords, we'll start in the top left corner and scan down to the bottom right hand corner. And that's because we read from top left to bottom right. But you'll also find that people who come from cultures where they read from right to left tend to prefer diagonals the other way, so starting in the top right and running down to the bottom left. So it doesn't really matter which way round you go, but try to make those diagonals run from approximately corner to corner. And the other thing that you could do when you were taking this is think about the background. So you have got some background distractions there, and I think if you just rotated around a little bit, you'd have found a composition where you didn't have that stuff in the background that's just leading the eye away from the flower. If you'd done so though, you wouldn't have been face onto the flower, so you would need to also think about where to focus. And in that scenario, a good thing to do is to focus on the very front edge of the flower and let the rest of the flower drift into out of focus background. Having a think particularly about what your background looks like so that it doesn't distract from your subject is something that you could go on to do. Next up, we've got a photo of this lovely sanderling from Andrew Charles, and Andy has some other beautiful photos online at Andy_J_wildlife. And on his profile, I found a great photo of a pigeon and some starlings tearing into a bag of rubbish. It's a really great urban wildlife shot, so please head over there and check that out. Now, Andy has been into photography for about 5 years, but only switched to doing wildlife in the last year. And Andy says this is the first photo that made him feel like a wildlife photographer. So Andy, first, I think you're being a little bit hard on yourself. We all have to go through a learning experience, and with this photo, you've absolutely got the right idea. This is so close to being great in lots and lots of ways. What I can tell you is that when I first saw the JPEG of this image, I had thought that you'd blown out the highlights a little bit, but you kindly sent me your RAW file, and I can see from that actually it's right on the edge of being blown out. So what you photographed here is a really difficult situation because the bird is backlit, it's in the middle of the day, it's not even sunrise backlit. So it's a tricky time to get that right, and you've absolutely nailed it. And you've also got absolutely the right idea about being down on the ground, low, and photographing the bird at its level. And you can see in this photograph that the foreground blur is really nice, and right at the bottom, you've got just the start of some bokeh coming in. Now, if you'd actually tilted your camera down a little bit, so instead of looking directly at the bird, you were looking ever so slightly down at it, you'd have got even more of that wonderful foreground in. So that's something to think about for next time around. But the main thing for you here is the composition. And I think there's a lot of negative space that doesn't add anything to this photo. So something you definitely should do is think about composing your photo with the bird and the negative space in front of it rather than behind it. And that allows the viewer to think about where the bird is moving into or potentially what it's looking at. But having negative space behind and above the bird doesn't really help your photograph in any way. So that composition will really help if the bird is just offset to the other side. And Allow me to show you a little bit. If I move this around in Photoshop and try and position the bird on the other side, it's going to look really rough. It's not going to look good because I'm not aligning everything up. I'm not trying to make this photo look nice, just to show you the position. The feeling of the photo is much better when the negative space is in front of the bird. But given this is the photo that you took, there's something that you could do to improve it even more, and that's to crop it. So if we crop down to the bird just to put it at the top of the frame and slightly to the left, you'll see it actually really emphasises that foreground blur that you've created. So with this crop, it's a much more compelling photo. You feel in that bird's world. And not only that, you will emphasise that beautiful foreground blur that you've created because it takes up more of the frame. And many people will tell you not to crop this heavily. I think it depends upon what you're using it for. If you're aiming to blow this up to the size of a billboard, then absolutely you shouldn't crop. You're wasting far too many pixels. But if your aim is just to put this on Instagram, then you can absolutely do it. Now let's have a look at the crop that I've just done. You can see here that the dimensions of it are 2090 pixels by 2786 pixels, which is bigger than the resolution that Instagram uses. So you can absolutely crop away in that scenario. Cropping really depends upon what your use for it is. So Andy, well done. Please keep it up. I think you're doing great. And in this photo, what you've done well is getting to the bird's level and getting that exposure spot on for the scenario. What you could do is thinking about having more of the foreground blur in by tilting your camera down slightly, and what you should do is think about recomposing that or cropping it afterwards to get a really nice composition that's more compelling. So next up, I've got another photo from a photographer with a French name, Jacques Lech, and hopefully I've pronounced that right. But Jacques is from Quebec, Canada, and he sent me a couple of photos of mallards, one male, one female. And lots of people sent me more than one photo, and for most of them I've chosen only one, but for Jacques I'm going to show you both of them. But I'd also recommend that you head over to his website because he's got lots of beautiful photos. In particular, I really like a photo of a bufflehead, and also there's a photo of an osprey with a moody sky in the background. Jacques is an absolutely great photographer who needs no help from me with photography, but what I can help you with, Jacques, is your editing. So Jacques, you have a particular style to your editing, and I absolutely applaud that. And let's take a look at these photos. So firstly, the female mallard. You can see there's a real differentiation between the bright spots and the dark spots in the picture. And you've created that with some masks for sure. Absolutely, I'm confident of that. And you've also done some what we used to call split toning, and people nowadays tend to refer to it as colour grading. But what you've done is added some colour into the shadows and some other colour into the bright spots. And that's absolutely fine. I have no problem with that. Just helping people understand how you've created what you've created. But in doing so, I think what you've done is change the format of the file that you're working with a number of times, and that has introduced some banding into your photos. Now, it's not easy to spot if you're looking at this on a screen the size of a mobile phone, but if you're looking at it on a computer or a TV, which is often where I watch my YouTube videos, you'll see this banding, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. It's really distracting. And what happens typically is that as you're changing the format of the file that you're working with, it loses some of the detail and the photo starts to break down. And I think because you're working in Camera Raw and Photoshop, that you've potentially been sometimes saving it as a TIFF file and then the next time saving it as a Photoshop file. And flicking between the two really isn't helping. So keep it in one file format, and then when you've finished with everything, you can change it to a JPEG. But you also want to watch out what you're doing as you change it to a JPEG, particularly as you are using radial masks to introduce these gradients that take you down to almost pure black. In 16-bit file formats like TIFF, for example, they can look absolutely smooth. But when you save it as a JPEG, which is an 8-bit file, you lose some of the detail of that gradient, and that is also another potential cause of the banding in your photos. So it's something to be aware of. I can't pinpoint the exact reason why there's banding, but it's likely to be one of the two things that I've just mentioned. So I'd recommend do a little bit more research, try the things that I've talked about, like keeping your photo in one file format throughout the editing process, and really look for that banding. Now, one way that you can keep your eye out for it is to, in Lightroom or Camera Raw, turn on the spot healing and use the option to visualize the spots. And as you move the slider up and down to show any spots, there are no spots in this photo, by the way, but this just helps you see the banding. You can really see where the banding comes in. And that's a good test to apply before you go and publish a photo, because, as I say, once you've seen that banding, you just can't unsee it. But Jacques, I absolutely applaud you. Your whole portfolio is fantastic. And I think if you can just make this little part of your editing process that little bit better, you'll go on to be a megastar. And next up, we've got a photo from Quentin Moss of a deer he photographed when walking in the Lake District. And you can see more of Quentin's photography on his Instagram page. And I absolutely love a photograph that's on there of a short-eared owl perched on a fence, and there's some beautiful bright band of foreground blur grass just underneath it. So well done for that, Quentin. But also well done for this photo, because it can be really difficult to capture photos of subjects that you're not expecting to see. Now, the first thing I would say is that the version of the photo that you sent me is cropped slightly differently to the one that's on your Instagram page. And on your Instagram version, you've got slightly more ground underneath the deer. With the version of the photo you've sent me, it's almost like you've maybe cropped off the bottom of the deer slightly, or the deer is just sat on the very bottom of the picture. And you want to give it a little more space to breathe, a little more space around your subject. But not only that, you've got the essence of some foreground blur. If we zoom in right to the bottom, you can see those blurry grasses. And if maybe you'd just taken a few steps back or zoomed out a little more, you'd have even more foreground blur underneath the deer. Now, I think the main problem with this photo, and something that you absolutely should do, is thinking about the composition. So let's analyse it. So you can see to the left of the deer, there's some fairly well in focused ferns and thistles. To the right of the deer, there's a pretty out of focus bush. There's a dark background, and then you've got some out of focus foreground grasses. And so around your subject, there's a lot of contrasts. And one of the things our eyes get drawn to in photography is contrast. So I always say, look out for the highlights, because eyes get drawn to highlights, but also look out for the contrast, because our eyes get drawn to contrast. And there's a lot of contrast here between some of those background elements. There's some that are almost black, and there's some that are a much brighter green. And also you can see from that bush on the right hand side, there's something that's just sticking out slightly in front of the deer, which distracts from it also. So thinking about this composition, if you were able to take a few paces to your left, you would have separated the deer from those ferns. You would have probably managed to get that bit of the bush that's sticking out that's in front of the deer, and you'd have positioned yourself so that the background was dominantly green and you didn't have those really dark blacks in it. So that would have meant that there's far less distraction in this photograph. So firstly, well done for capturing the deer, Quentin. I know it's not easy with deer. I've experienced myself many times that I've tried to photograph a deer in the wild and it's run off. But the technique I've found over the years that is most useful to me in capturing photos of deer is to turn around. So the minute I see it, I'm going to turn around and start walking away. And the reason for that is because deer will take a moment to assess you and decide if you're a threat. If they think you're a threat, they'll run. But if they see you walking away, they think, this isn't going to be any trouble for me. And it carries on doing what it's doing, which then enables you to turn around and get a photo of the deer in a very relaxed position. So there's a little bonus tip for you when it comes to photographing deer. So what you've done well, the good, is capturing it in the first place. What you should aim to do is change your composition. And I know that's difficult to do in the moment, but if you do get the opportunity to turn around, walk away and think about your composition, try and get a background that's got less contrast in it and try and get the foreground elements that don't overlap with your subject. And what you could do is zooming out a little bit or taking a few steps back to create more foreground blur in the lead up to your subject. But thank you for submitting your photo, Quentin, and thank you to everyone who sent photos to me for this video. I do plan to do more of these in the future, maybe one every couple of months, so keep your eye out because I'll be putting out another call for photos. I might be interested to do some that are based around themes, so potentially I could put a call out for macro or birds or mammals or black and white or whatever it is. Let me know what you think about that in the comments. If you'd like to see themed reviews of photos, let me know, or if you prefer me just to carry on making general calls for people to submit their photos, that's fine too. I want to know what you want to see. So I'll be back again very soon with more nature photography. In the meantime, why not check out this video? Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.